Hey Jennifer, have you ever heard of a woman named Deborah Lacks?
No, no, not Deborah Lacks. I've heard of Henrietta Lacks.
Okay, I'm going to tell you about Deborah Lacks, who was Henrietta Lacks's daughter. So before I get into that, I have a quote from her about her mother. It says, when people ask, and it seems like people always be asking to where I can never get away from it, I say, yeah, that's right. My mother's name was Henrietta Lacks. She died in 1951. John Hopkins took her cells, and them cells are still living today, still multiplying, still growing and spreading if you don't keep them frozen. Science calls her Gila, and she's all over the world in medical facilities and all the computers and the internet everywhere. When I go to the doctor for my checkups, I always say my mother was Gila. They get all excited, tell me stuff like how her cells help make my blood pressure medicines and antidepressant pills, and how all this important stuff in science happened because of her. But they don't never explain more than just saying, yeah, your mother was on the moon. She's been in nuclear bombs and made that polio vaccine. I really don't know how she did all that, but I guess I'm glad she did because that means she's helping lots of people. I think she would have liked that. But I always have thought it was strange. If our mother Cell's done so much for medicine, how come her family can't afford to see no doctors? Don't make no
Mhm.
sense. People got rich off my mother without us even knowing about them taking her cells. Now we don't get a dime. I used to get so mad about that to where it made me sick and I had to take pills. But I don't got in me no more to fight. I just want to know who my mother was.
Damn, that's messed up.
Mm-hmm.
Welcome to MILF,
I'm Courtney,
and I'm Jennifer.
and we are two moms into literary freedom. I got the goosebumps reading that, and I've already read it like five times. So, this book is called, that we're covering today, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, written by Rebecca Skloot. But even though the title is The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, I just can't stop thinking about Deborah Lacks. Like, she is
Yeah.
main character energy. She is like the star of this book. I love her so much. She's just so her story is so like I don't think inspiring is the right word, but it's like just so moving and like
Mm.
emotional. And it's kind of hard because I was kind of having like mixed feelings about Rebecca Skloot, who is the white woman who wrote this book.
Who is
Okay.
now also getting rich off her mom's
Yes.
story.
And that is what doesn't sit with me because in sit well with me because in the book there like it does get brought up like Rebecca these are Rebecca's words. She's typing these, right? And she's said something about like, well, I told Deborah that that's not how it works in her family like because she's one of five siblings that one of five kids that Henrietta had. And she said something, Rebecca said something along the lines of like it's not up to me, it's up to my publisher. Like bullshit. Like
Right.
you are writing the book. Like you can say, "Hey, let's write this book together. Let's do a 50-50. Let's put your fucking name on the cover."
I was gonna say, how hard is it to add her as a
Yeah. Yeah.
contributor or whatever you
It's
call it? I
not.
don't know.
It's not. And so that doesn't sit with me very well. And so I don't know. I don't have the numbers on how much money she makes, but let's just say this. This book was turned into a movie in 2017 with Oprah. Okay. So let's just assume that Rebecca Skloot has a lot of money.
Right.
And so that being said, this is a book that we are advocating for because it was challenged.
I mean, right. We might not like how it went down, but it
Yeah,
doesn't mean the book should be banned
exactly. But listen, the book was not banned because of
of that.
racism. Yeah, because of like it was a white woman. Like they were like, oh, this should be banned because a black person should have written it. It was banned by, or it was challenged by a white mom in Tennessee who confused the OBGYN with porn.
Oh my God. Because I haven't read this book. So I don't know what's in it.
Hmm.
I was thinking like if it's talking about her life, like maybe she had a
Hmm.
scandalous life. She's got five kids, four kids, five kids.
No. Yeah. No, she has five kids and she did get cancer from HPV, but it was from her husband. According to Rebecca's research, it was her husband who, kind of slept around on her and,
Of
gave her,
course.
yeah,
Damn men.
gave her all these STDs, one of which being HPV, which is what caused the cancer that killed her. Um, but the reason that this mom in Knoxville, Tennessee challenged this required reading as a part of a like curriculum, was because of the way they described the doctor's visits, and like they described like in detail like her reproductive organs. They said things like cervix, and ovaries and
Cervix,
uterus. Yeah.
scandalizing.
Right. Hysterectomy. They talked about hysterectomies, and we'll get into that later. Forced hysterectomies called, apparent appendectomies. Like it wasn't their appendix that they were removing without consent. It was their fucking uteruses. But we'll get into that later. I can't hear your dog, by the way, at all. So don't worry
You
about it.
can't because he's
No.
barking like an
No, I
idiot.
can't. It's crazy. These microphones are good because they only pick us up. So I can't hear him at all. So don't worry about it.
Okay.
Yeah. But anyway, what was I saying?
Sorry.
Oh yeah, the white woman in Tennessee who banned it. There was maybe we could argue that she didn't, because listen, she didn't read the book. No way she read the book. There
Right.
is scene, a sexual assault scene in the middle of the book, but it's like
Okay.
a paragraph. So there's no way that she knew it was there unless she read the whole book, which I don't think she did. I think it was like she read what the book was about, and she learned that
Hmm.
it was about a black woman's uterus, cells from her uterus being taken. And she was like, probably didn't want her kid reading something that was like so real. I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
that's just because, like, what else? It doesn't make any sense. Because
Can you
this,
hear me
now
now?
I can hear it. Yeah. What's he barking at? He agrees with us, I think. So it was challenged, in Tennessee, but it wasn't like banned. However, it was taken off the required reading list. And to
Mm.
me, that's a problem because this is funny because when was it? What year was it banned? I think it was 2015. Okay.
Okay. So not that far ago.
Yeah,
10
it was 20
years
the book
almost.
the book came out in 2010, and then 5 years later it was challenged in Tennessee. And here's what's interesting is I remember, let's see, 2014, because I was pregnant with my son and I was teaching biology. And I read this book with my biology class in 2014. And so now, 2015, it starts to get all this negative attention.
Hmm.
It starts to get taken off reading lists. And now, kids don't have the opportunity to learn about a remarkable woman and her family who were the victims and continue to be the victims of systemic racism.
Yeah, that's wild.
So I read it to my entry level bio class, like the normal kids,
And
whatever
what
you want
grade
to
is
call them,
that?
like ninth grade. So they were
Okay.
14. No, you know what? It was like a mix of 14 and 15-year-olds, some 16-year-olds, ninth and 10th grade. But the book is separated into three sections. And the first section is just kind of like about her life. And it talks about cells in a very accessible way so that students can learn about these cells and like cell biology, which is obviously a huge part of biology. It's like the foundation of biology, our cells.
Right.
And I read it with my kids, and we would just read one chapter. They're not super long, one chapter like once a week. Didn't even do it every day. It was just like, hey, you're learning about cells. Here's a relevant story about cells,
Right.
right? They were so interested. And these are like the quote normal kids that,
Don't
they
normally read, who aren't into
yeah,
studying.
they're not the high achievers, they're just like,
Right.
I'm here because I have to be. But they loved it. They were like the question, and I knew that because of the questions they were asking, and like, and we didn't, it's a long book, so we couldn't get through the whole thing because cells, it's not a unit that takes up the whole year.
Right.
But we only read a little bit of it. But my point is now, fast forward to 2024, there's no way a biology teacher could read this book.
That's so crazy.
Yeah, like so many parents would be like, "What?" And I mean, and even if we give the parents the benefit of the doubt, teachers aren't going to read it out of fear for their job.
Right.
And I don't blame them for that.
Yeah. And if it's already been challenged at one point, like
Exactly.
the rule, especially here in Florida, I don't know about other states, but is to not use something that's been challenged.
Exactly.
So every day we limit what the kids have access to
Yeah, and you might
every
think
day.
Yeah, and you might think like, oh, it's only been challenged in Tennessee. And I hate it when people say that. It's like, oh, it wasn't banned, it was challenged and it was only one school district, 10 years ago. Like, no, that ruins it. It's like the scarlet
Yeah.
letter for a book. Like,
Hmm.
I mean, it makes
Yeah.
some people want to read it, but then it makes like teachers and parents like, oh no, I can't let my kids see that.
Right. And teachers are going to start doing that, where if there's a book that they want to read in class, first thing they're going to do is see if it's ever been challenged
Hmm.
because they don't want to bring that heat on themselves.
Regardless of how many awards it gets, which this book is the winner of several awards, including the 2010 Chicago Tribune Heartland Prize for Nonfiction, the Wellcome Trust Book Prize, American Association for the Advancement of Science Award for Excellence in Science Writing, and a Medical Journalists Association Open Book Award.
Wow.
And yeah, so in that's just a few of them, right? It's featured in more than 60 media outlets, including the New York Times, Oprah, NPR, Entertainment Weekly. And, you know, the fact that it's getting awards about scientific research,
Yes, that's
that, yeah, that makes me like kind of like look past Rebecca Skloot's what's
questionable
yeah.
morals.
Yeah. And you gotta think like it's crazy that so much has changed in such a short period of time regarding systemic racism and like in like white people understanding it, I think. And I'm
Yeah.
saying that as a white woman who doesn't know much about it. But just that like in 2000, 24 years ago when Rebecca was writing this book, it was very different.
Right. Like her
And
including that in the book, like, oh look, I'm not doing anything wrong.
yeah.
Today, everybody would be like, no, bitch, you're doing something wrong.
Right. Rebecca Skloot would probably be canceled if she tried to do this today.
Right.
So that's what makes this just very interesting and a very interesting conversation. Because if she were to write this book today, Deborah Lacks would be an author,
Right.
because like Deborah went on she called them reporting trips. And Deborah and Rebecca had a very close relationship. And Rebecca has a very close relationship with the Lacks family today, with the exception of a few people who kind of see through it. And they're like,
Hmm.
you know, one of which I'll tell you about right now is named Ron, and he is Henrietta's grandson. So
Okay.
Henrietta had five children. Their names are in order of age: Lawrence, Sonny, Elsie, Deborah, and then the youngest is Zachariah. And Lawrence was 16 years old when his mother died, and he wrote a book in 2020 or 2020.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so the timeline is basically like,
He was the oldest, right?
yeah, no, his so Ron read a book. Sorry, Lawrence's son Ron
Oh, okay. Lawrence is the oldest and his son Ron.
wrote a book.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's called Henrietta Lacks: The Untold Story, and it's the book I'm gonna link. I'll link both of them, but I'm gonna link this one first because I feel like if you want to learn about Henrietta Lacks, you should read Ron's book first.
That makes sense.
Because you know how you read two perspectives, and usually the first one is like the one that you want to stick with because it's the first one you were exposed to.
Yeah.
It's weird, but it's just, human nature, I guess.
Right.
I feel like I'm gonna read Ron's book and which is full of like contradictions to Rebecca's book. So I'm excited to read that to see like what and the family's perspective is in terms of like how Rebecca messed up writing this book. The part where Rebecca did not mess up in writing this book is the science and the history. And that's kind of the important part of this book.
History as far as what happened scientifically.
Yes. Because
Okay.
it's just full like from like lawsuits to medical advancements to, like all of that kind of stuff is in this book. And she is a really good researcher. She's a really good writer. And it's such an easy read. Like it's good for like anyone can read it, even if, and I know I have like somewhat of a background in biology, but like you don't need a background in biology to read and
Okay.
enjoy this book. It is such a good book. So she did a really good job. I think, obviously she would have done things differently if she had written it today. But here's what Ron says about his book. He says, I really need people to understand the reason behind me writing this book about my grandmother. Henrietta Lacks. For those that have never heard of her, she is the first human whose cell line was able to grow in culture. Her cells were unlike any other cells. While other cells would die, Henrietta Lacks's cells doubled every 20 to 24 hours. She has contributed to the medical field in ways no other cell line has done. HeLa Cells has helped with polio, the polio vaccine, gene mapping, in vitro fertilization, sensitivity to tape, which is an interesting detail.
Yeah.
Dental, and it's even been used in the cosmetic field. To hear and read constantly that Henrietta Lacks was a poor black farmer is hard to accept. Anyone that looks at her picture can tell that Henrietta and her husband David Lacks weren't poor black farmers. They enjoyed the finer things in life. They moved from Clover to Baltimore, not out of poverty, but because they felt their children would get a better education here. I decided it was time to let people have an inside look at the side of the family that people don't hear about much, and that's Lawrence Lax's family, Henrietta's oldest son. He's the only one who's still alive that knew his mother. My dad was 16 years old when his mom passed away. It still brings tears to my eyes when he thinks about, sorry, it still brings tears to his eyes when he thinks about all the pain and suffering that she went through before her passing. And then it goes on to, say a little bit more about the differences between his book and Rebecca's book. And then the last thing he says is, it's not often that we as African Americans get to share in the telling of our own stories. Most of the time, the people are long gone, and we can only go by what people decided to say happened and not the actual truth of what happened.
Yeah, that's true.
So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there before I talked about the book because it's important to get both perspectives.
Right.
Although Rebecca does quote the Lax family verbatim in this book because they asked her to. And they're like, don't like whitewash what we're saying. Like
Right.
don't like quote fix our grammar, Um,
Okay.
and so she says that in like the beginning of the book, like the Lax family asked me to, and I agree with them. Like I'm not changing anything that they say. Everything that they say has been recorded in interviews and I'm typing it verbatim, right?
Okay.
So like I think that, when you look at it that way, it's like she did her best to,
In that time frame, she thought she was doing her best. Was
yes.
it her best? No.
No, because she's a
But
fucking millionaire now.
like that's a problem that I think happens a lot. Like
hmm
white women think they're doing the right thing, being
Yes.
good. But in reality, they're still doing the same shit
They're not listening.
that the bad white women are doing.
Yeah, they're not listening. And yeah, and everyone's born with unchecked or with biases, right? And they just
Yeah.
have to figure them out and work towards fixing and know that they'll never be 100% unbiased.
Right.
A lot of people, or there are a few people on the internet, when you do some really deep research into this, say Rebecca Skloot was a white savior. So, but then other people are, try and like Deborah, for example, like she and Rebecca were buds. So
Right.
let me tell you a little bit about Deborah. So she had a rough life after Henrietta died. The kids went to live with their dad, and he remarried a woman named Ethel, who was basically the wicked stepmother
Hmm.
and abused them mentally and physically. And
Oh,
and it's so devastating because one of the last things that Henrietta said to her husband David, who they call Day, was take care of the kids. And
that's not what he did.
it's heartbreaking. Yeah. And so Ethel was a wicked stepmother, and the youngest son, Zachariah, got the worst of it. And that can be seen in the way that Rebecca, she writes it as accurately as she can, as realistically as she can. Zachariah, the youngest Lax child, really suffers. He's in and out of jail. He's in and out of assisted living in like halfway houses. You can attribute that to the abuse that he suffered as a child. He was also pregnant, or sorry, Henrietta was pregnant with Zachariah when she was undergoing her radiation treatments. And so,
Oh, so who knows what happened with that too?
but that's what the Lax family blames it on, even though the
Not
wound,
the
yeah.
abuse.
Yeah, I think it might be a combo at the very least, but yeah.
Right.
But anyway, Lawrence, the oldest son, remember he died, or when he was 16 when she died, marries a woman named Bobette, who is the best thing that can happen to the Lax family, according to Rebecca. And Bobette saves the kids from this abusive household, and she does her best as I guess she's the sister-in-law, to try and take care of those kids.
Okay.
She does her best, but it's kind of hard to protect them. And Deborah suffers sexual abuse from a much older cousin. She's 14, he's like in his 40s. And
Wow, that
it's
sucks.
just, yeah, it's disgusting. But, Deborah is resilient.
Is that the scene that they have an issue, not an issue with, but that you thought might?
I thought, yeah, maybe there's one paragraph and it says the word penis and it describes the essay, the sexual assault. But that's it. All it says is penis, so like I don't think it was
Right.
why this book was challenged. I think the challenge came from like the medical part and like the opinion of the mother that like, you can learn science without being exposed to the graphicness of
Ugh.
cervical cancer. Like let me just read you a quote that Rebecca, the author, said in regards to the banning. So Rebecca says, a parent in Tennessee has confused gynecology with pornography. I hope the students of Knoxville will be able to continue to learn about Henrietta and the important lessons her story can teach them. Because my book is many things. It's a story of race and medicine, bioethics, science illiteracy, the importance of education, and equality in science and so much more. But it's not anything resembling pornography. And so that's what the mother, she used the word pornography and said, this is a pornographic book. Listen, let's talk
Right.
about being uneducated.
Right.
You don't know what the word pornography means.
Yeah. And this is something we deal with all the time with book banners. They confuse pornography with anything remotely sexual or
Yeah.
that has to do with reproductive
Hmm.
organs, anything. They're just
Yeah. Abuse.
assault.
Exactly.
But I will say I see this a lot where we keep shushing like the educated people in the room
Hmm.
and giving the uneducated people a platform and like the right to make not the I don't want to say the right because like duh, we all have rights, blah blah. But I guess we're giving them decision making power
Hmm.
that they don't have the qualifications for.
Yeah, like the censorship is out of hand in the fact that like you said an uneducated person, right? And when I say uneducated, I mean like doesn't care to figure it out themselves. It's like you don't have to
Right.
go to college to understand that pornography is not the same as gynecology. Like you just have to like as long as you can read, right? And you can think for yourself, you read this book or you look into it, like you can decide that it's not pornography. But these people aren't really uneducated as much as they're just like choosing to be ignorant.
Right, closed-minded. And I
Yeah.
do mean uneducated in the sense of here is a professor who studied this specific
Mm.
topic and is
Hmm.
educated on this material,
Hmm.
and they're telling you this is good material, this is material that, will help a student.
Hmm.
And here comes a mom, like let's say me,
Hmm.
I've got no business saying, "Oh no, this is not going to help a child." I don't
Exactly.
know that.
Exactly. Yeah. That is such a good point. And that's an example of like when white people try and,
I'm here.
ignore the experts in the field, right?
Right.
I'm going to use that as a segue into a different example in which Black people are valid in not wanting to trust the experts. So what you said, I agree with 100%. But this is an issue of race, and because of the actual definition of systemic racism, which is like policies and laws that are in place to prevent non-white people
Right.
from advancing in, living lives that, they're basically told that they can't live. The Lacks family is a glaring example of this, which is why this book is really important, at the very least, to tell the story of how a Black family was mistreated
Right.
since she was born in 1920. So Henrietta Lacks was born in 1920 after slavery, but she grew up in a slave house in a town in Virginia, which they called Laxtown because it was where all the Laxes lived. And they were actually related to one of the previous slave owners. So there was actually some like mixed race in
Hmm.
there. And so what's interesting is like if you go to Virginia, you'll see and you look up the Lacks name, there's white people named Lacks and there's black people named Lacks. And the black people will say, according to Rebecca in this book, that yeah, all the Laxes are related. Like they can trace their genealogy back to one white slave
Right.
owner. But the white people will deny, deny, deny.
Right.
But
They'll
anyway,
probably
back
claim something like they took their slave owner's name, not that,
yes.
their great great granddad raped a woman.
Yeah, and that's exactly what they'll say.
Mhm.
And but what's interesting in, Rebecca and Deborah's research, because Deborah helps Rebecca do all this research, which is why her name should be on this cover.
Yes.
But in their research, they learned that the white slave owner, I forgot his name, well, Lax, he
Mhm.
gave half of his land to the black Laxes and half to the white Laxes. And then that's how they kind of became a separated town. And then that's where, Henrietta was born. And she married David Lax, who was her first cousin. And that was
Okay.
pretty normal back then, I guess, in that area because the White Laxes, Ruby and Carlton, were also first cousins. And so I just thought that was interesting. But
Yeah.
because they were first cousins, their children all had hearing issues. And so
Because
they
of the
think,
inbreeding.
yeah, yeah. So they think,
Is that how you say that? Sorry if that's
I don't know. We can't have all the right words, can we?
right.
So back to why it's valid for Black people to not trust the medical professions, which, we've all heard about this. At least I hope
Right.
so. And if we haven't, it's because books like this are banned. Okay. And
Right.
we should, as early as middle school, maybe even younger. Like, why not? If you can learn about slavery, you should be able to learn about these examples of Black history and injustice in science, such as the Tuskegee syphilis study, the Mississippi, quote, appendectomies, which weren't actually appendectomies, and the something called, quote, night doctors, which is what gave rise to the Ku Klux Klan hoods. Are you
Oh,
familiar? Have you heard of at least one of those things?
no.
Tuskegee syphilis? You haven't heard of that?
No.
See,
Maybe
here's
in school it did. I
no,
mean,
you
but
did. I'm sure you didn't. No, the reason that have heard of this is because I am a science writer, right? But these are things that should be taught, but aren't because history is so whitewashed. Like, for
right.
example, I was helping my son with his history, like the Spanish colonizers, and like when they first came to Florida, like Juan Ponce de Leon and stuff like that. And they were like, oh, by the way, here's two black conquistadors, which means to conquer, right? And
Right.
so they painted it in his little history section as like a triumphant story of how black people also had a role in history.
Right.
Like, no, I think you're missing a couple perspectives here.
Right.
So history is still very much whitewashed.
And it
Um,
will continue to be. I just had this conversation with my daughter, 'cause she's getting ready to vote. And she was like, what, January 6th, she's kind of paying more attention. And she's like, oh, well, it's going to be in the history books. And I
mhm.
was like, well, we will see how it ends up in the
Right.
history books, depending on who wins or, who stays
Yeah.
in power. And so I was telling her kind of like how, like the daughters of the Confederacy or something,
Yeah.
daughters of the, how
Hmm.
they managed to whitewash history and like paint Confederate soldiers as good
Exactly.
people. Like we have schools named after them, we have
Hmm.
monuments of them. And I'm like, who does that for the bad people? Like
Yeah. And there are
it,
some young white people out there that still believe that having a Confederate flag on their t-shirt is a symbol of pride and not
yeah,
racism. And that's so sad to me because these kids are being brainwashed into thinking that that the Confederacy isn't anything but racism. And that
right,
really pisses me off. But and it's the same idea. Like if we weren't challenging books like this, if this was required reading for English, like it doesn't, or if like science teachers weren't afraid to read excerpts of books like this, right? Then you, for example, might, and our kids collectively might know what the Tuskegee syphilis study is. And I'll tell
right.
you what it is right now. So in the 1930s, the Department of Health killed hundreds of Black men on purpose for the goal of learning how to treat and cure syphilis. And
Wow.
they tricked these men into thinking they were getting free meals a warm place to stay, and even stipends for their families. And even after these scientists learned that penicillin would cure syphilis, they continued to let
To
black men die.
test.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. It's murder.
And
It's
and
murder.
that's not the first time that I've heard of stuff like that happening.
Hmm.
Black people, Black women
Hmm.
specifically, not men. I'm not making sense.
No, I get what I'm picking up
Black
what you're
women
putting down.
still to this day struggle with doctors and not being
Yes.
taken seriously.
Because
So
of all of this.
I'm sure it happens to men too, but specifically, it's
Black
something that I
women.
hear a lot with Black women.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important to make sure you have a voting plan. That the fact that this episode is being recorded during early voting in Florida, which, you might think like, what's the point? Trump is gonna win Florida. So sure, fine. I agree with you because of the stupid electoral college and the way that it's set up. Like Kamala could get the popular vote and it wouldn't matter. We all know Trump is gonna win Florida, but you can go out and still vote yes on Amendment 4.
Right.
And that matters. So at the very least, go out and vote yes on Amendment 4, which, codifies, I think that's the right word, abortion rights into our state constitution. And if you think it's not going to work, you're wrong because it worked in Ohio.
Right.
Recently, a judge blocked a ban, a total near abortion ban. I believe it was in Ohio because Ohio has already codified abortion rights in their state constitution. And so the judge was like, you can't block abortion. It's in the state constitution. And that's what Florida is attempting to do this November. So get out and vote yes on Amendment 4.
Please.
But back to your point about Black women not trusting the medical professionals or the medical system is, for whatever reason, which I'm going to say that reason is racism. There is a much higher, you know, what's it called, mortality rate
Yes.
in Black women when
Births, right?
well, yeah, childbirth, but also other things, not just childbirth, but yeah, childbirth is sort of like up there. It's like
Right.
why are more Black women dying than white women when they're giving birth? Like that doesn't add up at all. Here's a good 5-star story though, related to that. A 23-year-old student midwife who is a Black woman, but this is in Great Britain, but still, it's still really cool,
Right.
created an app to help improve care for Black babies and mothers by raising awareness of the symptoms of maternal and neonatal conditions on Black and brown skin. So,
Okay.
so she is a midwife who is making a change. Her name is Ruby Jackson. She said she was inspired to create, it's called Melanatal, due to a general lack of understanding about how some conditions present in people who are not white. If we all offer patients and clinicians visual guides to the signs and symptoms of conditions including jaundice, preeclampsia, and mastitis. So she's a University of Brighton student who has secured a place on the National Health Society, I think that's what that stands for, NHS, Clinical Entrepreneur Program, and she hopes to pilot the app within a trust upon its completion. And this is all because of a report and others that found between 2019 and 2021, women from Black ethnic backgrounds were 4 times more likely to die during pregnancy or immediately afterwards than white women. You
And
can
that is
blame
a
it,
high number. That's wild.
you can blame it on their melanin or you can blame it on racism. That's up to you. I'm sure it's a little bit of both,
Right.
but yeah. So another example, which I didn't learn about, like I had heard of the Tuskegee syphilis study, but I hadn't heard of the Mississippi appendectomies.
Mm.
I mean, I'd heard like bits and pieces, but like, you're never presented with research in school,
Right.
even though it's such an important part of history. And if we have slavery in our state standards, then we should, we do, I know as a teacher, as an educator, I know that the standards include Black history, but Ron DeSantis has whitewashed our history standards. And so now he just wants, quote, success stories, which is great.
Right.
I think we should have success stories, but it's like the pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality. Like, what if you don't fucking have bootstraps?
And it's incomplete.
But the Mississippi appendectomies was mainly for doctors to practice on how to perform a hysterectomy. And they did it on Black women and told them they were giving them an appendectomy instead of a hysterectomy. And
Wow.
they did this, one, for practice, but two, because they wanted to sterilize.
That
Yeah.
I have heard about. Like wouldn't know specifics, but I know that I have heard of things like that happening, which is why there's a lot of distrust. And that totally makes sense. I think
Hmm.
where I have an issue is not with that, it's with white people who have never had a reason to distrust
Yeah. Oh,
the
yeah, I
government.
agree.
And they are the biggest like
Yeah.
conspiracy theory
Yeah.
theorists and all this. And I'm
No, I
like,
agree 100%.
that's where my issue is. Like
And that is
people who
where
have been
it should
wronged,
be.
yeah, I
Hmm.
understand why you're,
No, I agree. And that's why you just, when you said that, it just made me think of
yeah.
like the other side of the coin. So
No, no,
like
and it's good that
two
you
sides of the
pointed it
coin.
out because
Yeah.
I'm thinking of this lady,
Hmm.
and I'm not trying to quiet down people who have
Yes.
legitimate reasons for feeling that
Hmm.
how they feel.
Yeah.
I'm just saying
Yeah,
these people
because
don't have it. It's
right, white
just
people do not have a reason to think that doctors are out to get them. Like they
right.
just don't. But black and brown people do. And another thing is the sickle cell anemia is a genetic condition that affects mainly I think it's just African Americans, mainly, not exclusively, right? But there's no funding for it. Like if you were to compare the funding for sickle cell anemia to like Tay-Sachs disease, which is something that mainly affects a white group of people, you would see that there's way less funding for sickle cell anemia than there is for Tay-Sachs disease. So that's just another example of injustices within the medical
Right.
community,
And
I
that's
guess.
pretty obvious to see why. Explain why, what's a good reason for that? And you have none.
Mm,
There
yeah.
can't be. Like, why?
So despite all of this, and we got to remember that these things happened when Henrietta was alive, like she had heard of likely had heard of the Tuskegee syphilis study. Despite all of this, and in the night doctors, which I didn't really talk about, but basically it's when like slave owners put on white hoods, which is where the KKK came from, and they would scare their enslaved Africans at night and scare them from running away. They didn't want them to run away. So they would like pretend to be ghosts. Okay. And you got to imagine back in the
What?
1800s, if you're like an enslaved African and you're like ready to escape and you see a white ghost like in the woods, and you got to also
Right.
remember their religion and their culture and their beliefs is deeply connected to the spiritual realm.
Right.
And so they believe, according to the research that Rebecca did here with the Lacks family, that if you were to see a ghost, it means that you could get sick. So if you see a ghost and then you get sick the next day, the ghost made you
The
sick.
ghost.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's where the night doctors came in, and that sort of like tied into somehow like doctors in the 1800s when slavery was at its peak or whatever would would operate on enslaved Africans, obviously without their consent, just to practice. And they did this by just sort of like capturing them at night. And
Wow.
this was happened to be in the same area, like Baltimore, which is where Henrietta lived with her kids when she found out she had cancer. And despite knowing knowing all of these things, Henrietta knew she was sick and she went to Johns Hopkins University, is a it is a hospital to this day
Right.
that
And a
is set up.
university, right?
Yeah, is set up. It's built for, the poor population. So even though Black Americans associated this region of, where Johns Hopkins is located with nefarious history and racism, they also associated Johns Hopkins with that, right? Even though it was a free institution where you could go and get free medical care. Johns Hopkins was like and his first name was Johns. It's kind of hard to say. So a lot of the people just say John Hopkins, right?
Right.
But he was a rich guy who did something good, like Bill Gates, right? He was a millionaire in the 1800s, which is a lot of money.
Right.
But with all millionaires, billionaires, let's say, we don't want your charity. We want you to pay your damn taxes.
Right. Just pay your fair share.
Yes, it's great that Johns Hopkins exists, but you should, as millionaires and billionaires, you should be paying your fair share of taxes so that we can have these government programs so that everybody gets a taste, right?
Right.
Not just people who live near Baltimore, right? And
Right.
actually trust the medical community not to take your cells without permission and then become billionaires, which is exactly what happened to Henrietta.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask you. So, did she willingly give up her cells, or
No.
they were like, "Oh, here are her cells. They're cool. We're just going to
Mhm.
use them."
So it's complicated because Johns Hopkins is really a well-intentioned organization.
Right.
And so there's a researcher there named George Guy, and he asked the doctors whenever you get a cancer patient, give me their cells. And so they did. Didn't matter who if you were white, brown, or black, he got their cells. And this was, you got to remember, before informed consent was a thing,
Right.
and you could basically do whatever you wanted. And so Henrietta went in and they diagnosed her with cancer. I think they misdiagnosed her, of course, but either way, she would have died. It was some kind of cancer. They scraped her cells, sent it to George Guy, gave her radiation treatment. It didn't work. She ended up dying on October 4th, 1951. But this was after George Guy had already collected her cells. They actually asked Day Lacks, and he said no at first. And then they said, well, if you say yes, it could help your kids not get cancer in the future. And so because they phrased it that way, he said yes.
Right.
And so now I think, like that prevented them from being able to take legal action back then. And they also
Right.
didn't know anything about the law. And am I not recording? No, it is
I am
recording.
on my end.
That's so funny. I got scared there for a minute. So they were taken without, anyone's really informed consent is the difference there. Like informed consent is different from like consent because
Right.
doctors are gonna like be tricky. And like I would consider myself uneducated when it comes to things like law and
Right.
cancer research. And so I would say that the Laxes were very uneducated when it comes to this. And but Ron Lax, doesn't want his family portrayed in like a uneducated light. And I understand that. But like the truth of the matter is they were very uneducated about all of this, just like we are, you
Yeah.
know?
And we see that happen nowadays, not on that scale. But let's say, for example, like a today example, you have a video that you upload and it goes viral.
Hmm.
And then here comes like I don't know, viral hog or something, like one of those
Yeah.
that republish these things. And they send you a message and they're like, "Oh, we want to use your
Mm.
video.
Yeah.
And then can you sign this consent form?" Most
Uh,
people are like, "So cool, yeah, they're gonna share our
mhm.
thing." They
Mhm.
sign it, not realizing that they're signing over all the rights to
Mhm.
that video.
Yeah, that is a great analogy. And I'll take it a step further. If someone knew what they were signing over and said no, they would be like, fine, screw you. We don't care. We're going to move on to the next viral video.
Right,
And it wouldn't matter. And they wouldn't be able to go viral. And they wouldn't, their video wouldn't go viral anyway. So then it's like nobody gets money. Right.
right.
And that's kind of what I'll fast forward a little bit here to when this actually became a lawsuit with not Henrietta Lacks, but a different guy named something Moore. And it was this John Moore, same exact situation. Instead of HeLa cells, they were called Mo cells. And long story short, he sued and lost. And
Wow.
a fucking doctor, the dean of Stanford of medical something or other. I have the quote here, page 206. I got to read it because it's just so it makes you understand why people hate doctors. Like you don't have like all people have distrust of doctors regardless of their skin color because they have experiences like this. But he told a reporter after, he won his quote lawsuit or whatever it was, that as long as researchers disclose their financial interests, patients shouldn't object to the use of their tissues. If you did, he said, I guess you could sit there with your ruptured appendix and negotiate.
Wow.
Yeah. So he's basically saying like, hey, we're going to use your appendix cells because they're pretty important for science, and we're going to make this much money doing it. We need your permission though. And
And
we're
I won't
le
save you until you give it to
Yeah.
me.
Yeah, but that's how the patient feels,
Right,
and that's essentially what the doctor said, and it's like, and that's how you feel when you're sitting vulnerable in your little nightgown with no underwear on or whatever.
right,
On the cold exam table in a white, bright room, thinking that you're gonna die, you're so agreeable. You're like,
right.
yes,
Yeah,
whatever you
yeah,
want to
help
do.
me.
Yeah, and you're so intimidated because of the big words they use. you know?
Yeah, and no one's gonna sit there and read 2 pages of like
Legal
legal
documents.
jargon. They're just
Hmm.
gonna sign.
Yep. So unfortunately, John Moore lost that, and he tried. He really did try. But yeah, so despite all this, Deborah, she wanted to live for her kids, and so she tried to get better, and the doctors did try. It's Johns Hopkins, like they really did try, and they gave Henrietta, according to Rebecca's research, they gave Henrietta the same treatment they would have given anyone else, and according to Henrietta's medical records, which Rebecca never had. Deborah always had the medical records,
Okay.
according to this book. But other members of the Lacks family will say that Rebecca stole the medical records. But according to this book, Rebecca never had access to them. Deborah would barely even let her look at them because she was so protective of her mother's information. But according to, what she was able to find after, forming a trusting relationship with Deborah, Henrietta Lacks received very fair treatment,
Okay.
and they did their best to save her. But her cells are crazy. They're like the Blob. Do you know what the Blob is?
No, the movie, like the Blob?
Yeah, like the movie.
Okay.
So it's just like constantly getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
That's in like that might be an insensitive way to describe it, but it's the only way I can explain it. They just get bigger and bigger and bigger. And like so much so that they actually contaminated other researchers' cells
Wow.
because they're like the Ebola virus. They are airborne. These cells are so strong and powerful that you can open a vial of HeLa cells and they can float across the room like an angel. Okay. This is going to come
Really?
back later. Yeah. Like a spirit float across the room and infect another batch of cells. So then that scientist takes their infected batch of cells and they look at it. They're like, oh my God, my kidney cells have grown.
And it's
My
all
research is great. It's all for naught. Like millions of dollars, or yeah, millions of dollars in damage has come from the contamination of HeLa cells because they grow out so out of control. So that happened like in the 90s, I think. I don't know.
so I don't know biology very
Yeah,
clearly. So they just like regenerate? Is that like
they just divide.
divide?
So
Okay, so
yeah,
not regenerate, divide.
I mean, regenerate's a word you could use, I think, but the technical scientific term is mitosis,
Yeah, that
which
went right over my head.
which is just when you skin your knee and the new cells grow back, your body is regenerating. So that's the right word. It's skin cells by like making new ones. And it's a copy. It's like copying something on a copy machine.
Would it ever regenerate to like where physically you see something without like a microscope?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, it would be I think hypothetically it would just look like a blob on a petri dish, but it wouldn't grow into a human or like a heart or anything like that
Right.
because they're not stem cells, but her cells were used in stem cell research and they actually could be. And that's where like a lot of scary kind of stuff that the Lacks family didn't understand. I
Right.
still don't totally understand it, but it was like, a monkey hybrid made with HeLa cells, and that made them think like, oh, they're making monkeys with their mom's cells. Like that's
Right.
a very unsettling thought, you
Right.
know?
I could see that.
Yeah. And so, but it's just the bottom line is the science is really hard to explain. And, no one cared to explain anything to the Lacks family. So honestly, Deborah didn't find out about her mother's like famousness within the medical community until 20 years after they were taken from her mother. And so I guess in the 70s they kind of found out accidentally because George Guy, the Johns Hopkins researcher, was trying to protect their identity. Johns Hopkins didn't sell the cells for money. They gave them away for free.
Okay.
And not thinking, I guess, because this was like before you thought about like the thought that cells could make you money like that didn't really occur to him because he was like a all in for science and medical
Right.
advancement kind of guy. But he gave them away to some people who did think like that. And so that's when they started making a ton of money. And the first thing that they were used for was to create the polio vaccine and or not create to test basically test the polio vaccine to make sure they could give it to kids and people. So, her cells accomplished amazing things. But yeah, what else? What else should I tell you about all of this? I guess I'm gonna spend the last few minutes of this episode because I'll wrap it up because I basically covered everything. But I just want to tell you a little bit more about Deborah's sister, Elsie. So I told you about Lawrence. I told you a little bit about Zachariah. Honestly, there wasn't much in the book about Sonny, who is the second
Okay.
son. Yeah. And then Deborah is one of the two youngest. And then right in the middle is Elsie. Elsie was they don't know what she had, but they were pretty sure she had epilepsy at the very least. And so she they describe her as like a beautiful child, and there actually is a picture of her in the book, and she is a beautiful child. She's got smooth, like light brown skin and beautiful eyes. And they describe her as like I guess they use the terrible diagnosis of the word idiocy because they didn't have any, that's just what they said back then. But she was epileptic and she didn't speak, right? So Henrietta loved her. Henrietta was an amazing mother. She was an amazing friend. Her cousin Cootie described her as like the matriarch of Laxtown, who would always have like a pot of spaghetti and meatballs like on the stove for
Yeah.
anyone who was hungry. Like that, she was that kind of woman. She never raised her hand on any of her kids. She always made sure everyone not only was fed, but like had like buttered biscuits and bacon and like just like it was just and they lived in this like plywood slave, they called it the home house and it was the old slave quarters and they lived in it.
Right.
They were comfortable and they lived together and their family was so close knit. And the way that Rebecca describes it in the book is very loving. So Henrietta was a doting mother to Elsie, right? But they talked her into giving her or committing her to the Crownsville State Hospital because she was pregnant and like she was just, trying to take care of her other kids. And I think they were worried they couldn't care for Elsie, so they committed her. And it was actually called the Hospital for the Negro Insane, which is a terrible name, but
Wow.
I do think it is an accurate, name because well, in that it sounds like it's from a horror movie, right?
Right.
The conditions were from a horror movie. However, when Henrietta dropped off Elsie, she would visit her as much as possible, and she looked healthy. She looked clean. Her hair was always like braided, and face was clean, and she like didn't look like she was hungry, and like she looked like she was cared for. But then, like it just reached a tipping point, and I think this was in like the 40s, right? But then
Okay.
in the 50s, it reached this tipping point where like more and more Black people were being committed for things ranging from lack of confidence. Can you imagine being committed to an
Right.
insane asylum, which I know you're not supposed to say that, but that's the Negro insane is what it was called. Can you imagine being admitted to a hospital for lack of confidence?
Right. That's
For,
suspicious.
yeah, nervousness. Of course, there were more severe things like dementia and schizophrenia, but like the point is it was overcrowded.
Yeah.
And so because of that, things started to get out of control. There were like 200 patients per one doctor. Nothing was regulated. No one cared because these were Black people.
Right.
And even though it was the 50s, it was before civil rights, but even then, slavery wasn't legal, but Black people were not treated like humans.
Right.
So much so that they knew Elsie had epilepsy. And so doctors and researchers would come in and they would perform these terrible tests on her brain because they wanted to learn more about epilepsy. Basically, what they do is they suck all the fluid out of your brain. This sounds like a science fiction movie, but it's
Right.
it's for real. They suck all the fluid out of your brain and replace it with air to see how it like affects your body or something crazy like that. And
That
it
sounds
results
horrible.
yeah, and like how can you do that without killing someone? And it results in like insane migraines and vomiting and just like it's torture. It's
Yeah.
torture. It's called pneumoencephalography. And it was a technique developed in 1919. Oh, that helped. The reason they did it was it helped them take pictures of the brain. But in order to take pictures of the brain, you were putting the patient in extreme pain.
Right.
Yeah. And so they
And of
think
course they pick a Black child to do this too.
yeah, I mean that, and going back to the Mississippi appendectomies and Tuskegee syphilis and the night doctors, the Crownsville Hospital is at now on that list. And think about how many others that are undocumented out that That's four examples of how many, you
Yeah.
know? So they think that's what killed Elsie. And so Deborah discovers this and finds a picture of Elsie at her very worst. They don't include the picture in the book. I don't think they should either, but they do describe
Right.
what it looks like. And it's really sad to think of. And she, Deborah's like, that's my sister. And like it really weighs on Deborah. It's just a huge burden. And it leads to Deborah ultimately having a stroke or having stroke-like symptoms, like her blood pressure and blood sugar were like through the roof. So her cousin sees that she's struggling and like channels the spirit of God into Deborah because that's their belief, that's their culture, that's what gets them
Right.
through, and that's their that's of course they're allowed to do that and they should do anything that gives them comfort and helps them get through these challenges, right? But ultimately, that leads to Rebecca explaining what the Lacks really do believe about their mother, which is that her physical body died in 1951, but her spiritual body are the HeLa cells.
Okay.
So they think, that she is on the spaceship that goes to space, that she is in the atom bomb that they blow up. She is in the monkeys that they're, trying to mix her cells with. She's in the polio vaccine being injected into kids, saving their lives. Like she's everywhere because they view HeLa cells as her spiritual
As
body.
her.
Mhm.
Okay.
And that's why the
Well,
book is called The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, because she's immortal. She lives on forever. She's this angelic being that when you open up a vial of HeLa cells, a little bit of her spirit floats out and is like, "Hey, I'm gonna go on an adventure somewhere and do something." And they look at it in a positive way. They are
yeah.
proud of their mother. So,
That is,
but
I mean, it's very cool that they see it that way. Like
yeah,
she's forever here.
yeah, yeah. It's just so sad that that Elsie had to die the way that she died and that Deborah had to live the way that she lived. And I understand like, not wanting to like air out the family's dirty laundry
Right.
such as that, here she does air out Deborah's finances. In 2006, she got $732 a month for disability and $10 a month for food stamps like that. And she was at 2006, she should be retired.
Right.
She is an she's an old woman who should be retired. And she is barely like making it. And she dedicates her life to making sure that that Henrietta's grandchildren and great grandchildren are getting the education that they deserve. And she
The
said it's too late.
author.
No, Deborah.
Deborah. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And so Deborah says it's too late for us lax children, but not for our grandchildren and their children. So like she's making it her goal to make sure that the lax grandchildren get an education, which many of them do. And she talks about that in the book. Like one of them, her name is Jabria Lacks. She goes to a university to study science, and she gets like a full scholarship or something. So yeah, they're getting an education, and that's what Deborah really wanted. And so Deborah died in 2009, the day after Mother's Day, and it was a very heartwarming Mother's Day. Like Rebecca describes it in the book, that everyone was together, the family was together, they had good food, they had a great time, with enjoying each other's company, and there was a lot of love. And then she went home and she died peacefully in her sleep. And then one piece of good news that came out of this is that in 2023, so this was just a year ago, the Lax family settled out of court with a major medical company or something that has greatly,
Used her
yes,
cells.
yes, that has exploited her family and profited off of her cells. They settled out of court, and of course, everything is confidential. So we don't know how much
Which
money they got.
company?
No, we know the company is Thermo Fisher Scientific.
Oh, okay.
Huge company. Yeah, I mean, HeLa cells are everywhere. Like I was on a plane visiting my friends in Connecticut reading this book, and this guy was like, "Oh yeah, I worked with HeLa cells yesterday." I was like, "What are you
What?
talking
Right.
about?" He's like, "Yeah, I'm like a medical researcher, and we have HeLa cells in our blah blah blah." And I was like, "Are you kidding me?" He's like, "No. Do you understand like how like available HeLa cells are?"
I was gonna say, like, yeah, they keep
They're
reproducing
everywhere.
themselves, so they're
Hmm.
always available.
And they're,
That's so
they're
cool.
very
I
useful
mean,
as long as they're not contaminating other things.
right.
But so they settled outside of court and have no further comment. But the one of the families said, or one of the family members said something along the lines of, oh no, it was the attorney for the family said, not only were the HeLa cells derived from Henrietta Lacks, oh, the HeLa cells are Henrietta Lacks, and they were very happy with their settlement.
Oh,
So that's
good
good.
for them. Yeah,
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. And that is the story of Henrietta Lacks and her family. There's a lot more, but you got to read both books.
Very interesting. Yeah.
Mhm. Not enough is known about Henrietta Lacks and her family.
Yeah, and I think that that's why it's important we shouldn't be banning books. So
Hmm. Yeah, exactly. Also, get out and vote.
please, please,
Hmm. Hmm.
every vote counts, even if it doesn't feel like it.
Yeah, I know, and that's so frustrating to me because it's, in the electoral college, I feel like it's getting closer and closer to being just thrown out. Right, but we're not there yet, and that is what's so frustrating about that. And but before we end it, I just want to remind whoever the heck is still listening to this that DeSantis is just he's out of control. He's threatening TV stations with legal action if they air pro Amendment 4 ads. You
Right,
can't do that. That's dictatorship material.
right,
He's like trying to silence a brain cancer patient who's is speaking out about her abortion. If you have brain cancer, it's probably not great to be pregnant. Like
right.
you're probably at risk in many ways. And she's trying to tell her story, but DeSantis is trying to censor her story.
Where are the First Amendment people, who love to talk about
Exactly.
free speech, who
I don't
don't
know.
understand free speech, by the way? A majority of
Hmm.
them think that your comment being deleted on Facebook is a violation of their free speech.
Yep.
But
That's
this is actual violation of a free speech, of their free speech. This is a government telling you that you cannot say something.
And it kind of goes back to what you're saying about the difference between gynecology and pornography.
Right.
Like
Yeah,
you think you know,
exactly.
but you don't. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, you don't know.
Well, I guess on that note, don't ban bigots. Wait, do
Wait.
ban bigots.
I was like, hold on.
Ban the bigots, but don't.
Ban books.
There you go.
This episode has been engineered and mixed by your hosts, Jennifer Mendoza and Courtney Green.
Thanks for listening, and be sure to follow us at MILF for Books. That's MILF, the number 4, books on TikTok, Instagram, Threads, and X or Twitter or whatever you want to call it.
And don't forget to help the show by rating us wherever you get your podcasts.